Sahih al-Bukhari 1931-1932. Narrated Abu Bakr bin Abdurrahman. My father and I went to Aisha and she said, I testify that Allah's Messenger at times used to get up in the morning in a state of janaba from sexual intercourse, not from a wet dream, and then he would fast that day. Then he went to Salama and she also narrated a similar thing. Sahih al-Bukhari 1933. Narrated Abu Huraira. The Prophet said, if somebody eats or drinks forgetfully, then he should complete his fast, for what he has eaten or drunk has been given to him by Allah. Sahih al-Bukhari 1934. Narrated Humran. I saw Uthman performing ablution. He washed his hands thrice, rinsed his mouth and then washed his nose, by putting water in it and then blowing it out, and washed his face thrice, and then washed his right forearm up to the elbow thrice, and then the left forearm up to the elbow thrice, then smeared his head with water, washed his right foot thrice, and then his left foot thrice, and said, I saw Allah's apostle performing ablution similar to my present ablution, and then he said, whoever performs ablution like my present ablution and then offers 2 rakat in which he does not think of worldly things, all his previous sins will be forgiven. Sahih al-Bukhari 1935. Narrated Aisha. A man came to the Prophet and said that he had been burnt, ruined. The Prophet asked him what was the matter. He replied, I had sexual intercourse with my wife in Ramadan, while I was fasting. Then a basket full of dates was brought to the Prophet, and he asked, where is the burnt, ruined man? He replied, I am present. The Prophet told him to give that basket in charity, as expiation. Sahih al-Bukhari 1936. Narrated Abu Huraira. While we were sitting with the Prophet, a man came and said, O Allah's Messenger, I have been ruined. Allah's Messenger asked what was the matter with him. He replied, I had sexual intercourse with my wife while I was fasting. Allah's Messenger asked him, can you afford to manumit a slave? He replied in the negative. Allah's Messenger asked him, can you fast for 2 successive months? He replied in the negative. The Prophet asked him, can you afford to feed 60 poor persons? He replied in the negative. The Prophet kept silent, and while we were in that state, a big basket full of dates was brought to the Prophet. He asked, where is the questioner? He replied, I am here. The Prophet said to him, take this basket of dates and give it in charity. The man said, should I give it to a person poorer than I? By Allah, there is no family between its, i.e. Medina's, 2 mountains who are poorer than I. The Prophet smiled till his premolar teeth became visible and then said, feed your family with it. Sahih al-Bukhari 1937. Narrated Abu Huraira. A man came to the Prophet and said, I had sexual intercourse with my wife on Ramadan, while fasting. The Prophet asked him, can you afford to manumit a slave? He replied in the negative. The Prophet asked him, can you fast for 2 successive months? He replied in the negative. He asked him, can you afford to feed 60 poor persons? He replied in the negative. Abu Huraira added, then a basket full of dates was brought to the Prophet, and he said to that man, feed poor people with this by way of atonement. He said, should I feed it to poorer people than we? There is no poorer house than ours between its, Medina's, mountains. The Prophet said, then feed your family with it. Sahih al-Bukhari 1938. Narrated Ibn Abbas. The Prophet was cupped while he was in the state of Ram, and also while he was observing a fast. Sahih al-Bukhari 1939. Narrated Ibn Abbas. The Prophet was cupped while he was fasting. Sahih al-Bukhari 1940. Narrated Thabit al-Bunani. Anas bin Malik was asked whether they disliked the cupping for a fasting person. He replied in the negative and said, only if it causes weakness.